So our lesson today is on Calvin and missions. Are they compatible? There is great prejudice in our world today against John Calvin. And nowhere is the disdain of Calvin greater than in the area of missions. Numerous scholars over an extended period of time have argued that Calvin was uninterested in the mission of the church. Furthermore, they argue that Calvin's theology is completely incompatible with missionary endeavors. Well, this is simply untrue, and yet it continues to be peddled as established fact. Calvinists have no interest in outreach, whether in home or in foreign fields, they say. And sadly, some Calvinists actually reinforce this unfortunate stereotype by ignoring evangelism and neglecting outreach. Most offensive to modern minds is the idea of predestination and election. They caricature John Calvin as promoting cold fatalism. According to a podcast that I listened to, Calvin taught that your eternal destiny was predetermined and you were either going to heaven or you were going to end up in the trash bin. And there was nothing that could be done to escape divine punishment due to sin, so don't even think about trying. Well, this is fatalism. This is not Calvinism. I believe that a close examination of Calvin's theology will easily disprove the misleading image. Just a cursory glance at Calvin's writings will also silence this canard. And a careful review of his history should put this slander to bed once and for all. In this lesson, I want to say a few things about Calvin's theology and his writings, but to spend the bulk of my time looking at Calvin's history. The central concepts of theology that were embraced and taught by John Calvin were thoroughly biblical, and they were often drawn directly from the writings of the Apostle Paul. Take God's sovereignty in salvation, for instance. Paul taught that doctrine in Ephesians 1 and Romans 8 and 9 and other places as well. Indeed, Pauline theology places a strong emphasis on God's sovereignty in salvation. And yet, in its proper context, Paul's teaching leads to outreach rather than leading the church away from outreach. So let me give an example from the book of Romans. We read in Romans 8:28 through 30 the following words. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brethren. And these whom he predestined, he also called, and these whom he called, he also justified, and these whom he justified, he also glorified. Now that speaks of God's sovereignty in salvation. That's very clear. Well, just 2 chapters later, Paul writes these words. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? How will they believe in him whom they have not heard? And how will they hear without a preacher? And how will they preach unless they are sent? Just as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news of good things. This is the missionary mandate. So in chapter 8, we hear of his sovereignty. Here in chapter 10, the missionary mandate. And I think this demonstrates an irrefutable fact. The greatest advocate of God's sovereignty in salvation in the New Testament era was simultaneously the greatest missionary of the early church. Paul believed that God sovereignly elects and saves particular people, and that he does that through the preaching of the gospel. And Paul saw no contradiction between these two ideas. In fact, he saw them going together in perfect harmony. Likewise, Calvin believed and taught God's sovereignty in salvation, and he also taught our need to preach the good news to all creation. Calvin followed Paul. So listen to what Calvin says in his commentary on Isaiah chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. By these words, he first declares that the godly will be filled with such an ardent desire to spread the doctrines of religion that everyone not satisfied with his own calling and his personal knowledge will desire to draw others along with him. And indeed, nothing could be more inconsistent with the nature of faith than that deadness which would lead a man to disregard his brethren and to keep the light of knowledge choked up within his own breast. The greater the eminence above others which any man has received from his calling, so much the more diligently ought he to labor to enlighten others. This points out to us also the ordinary method of collecting a church, which is by the outward voice of men. For though God might bring each person to himself by a secret influence, yet he employs the agency of men that he may awaken in them an anxiety about the salvation of each other. Now that is a strong endorsement there for proclaiming the gospel. And he's saying it's inconsistent with the nature of faith to keep it all inside and hold it within yourself. If you have this knowledge, you're going to want to spread it to other people. And that's what missions does. Another example of his thinking is found in Calvin's commentary on Romans 10, verses 14 and 15. He writes, "It will hence at last appear that the Gentiles are not to be excluded from the kingdom of God, for God has admitted them into a participation of his salvation. For as the cause of faith among them is the preaching of the gospel, so the cause of preaching is the mission of God, by which it had pleased him in this manner to provide for their salvation. He intimates that it is a proof and a pledge of divine love when any nation is favored with the preaching of the gospel, and that no one is a preacher of it but he whom God has raised up in his special providence, and that hence there is no doubt but that he visits that nation to whom the gospel is proclaimed." Now here he's talking about the mission of God and how the mission of God sends forth preachers to proclaim the gospel so that people can be drawn in and saved through the proclamation of the gospel. Well, not only did Calvin preach that men should proclaim the gospel for the salvation of sinners, but Calvin spent his ministry doing this very thing. Before he settled in Geneva, Calvin preached Christ wherever he was able to. And after he took up his residence in Geneva, he proclaimed Christ to the people of his city. When he was forced out of Geneva, he went to Strasbourg, and he carried out gospel ministry among the inhabitants of that city. He was eventually called back to Geneva specifically in order to resume his gospel ministry to the chastened inhabitants of Geneva. Everywhere he went, all the time, he was preaching Christ and calling men to faith. Not only was Calvin active in that local ministry, but he carried on extensive correspondence with a wide variety of people throughout Europe. His special interest was with his countrymen still living in France. Calvin helped to start the academy in Geneva in order to train missionary pastors to return to France with the gospel. And although the king was a Roman Catholic and the Catholic hierarchy had a strong hold on France, the Huguenots were very effective in evangelizing France. At one point, it appeared that France might become a reformed country, so numerous were the Huguenot churches. And if not for the great slaughter of St. Bartholomew's Day, that might possibly have happened in France. There are two other fields that I want to focus on, Brazil and North America. In these foreign lands, Calvin and the church in Geneva sought to plant the gospel. They not only hoped to provide a safe haven for the persecuted French Calvinists, the Huguenots, they also had a desire to evangelize the Indians in those faraway places. The first effort was the mission to Brazil. In the register of the Company of Pastors in Geneva, there is a concise record which reads as follows. 25th August 1556, ministers sent to Brazil. On Tuesday, 25 August, in consequence of the receipt of a letter requesting this church to send ministers to the new islands, Brazil, which the French had conquered, Pierre Richier and Guillaume Chartier were elected. These two pastors were subsequently commended to the care of the Lord, and they were sent off with a letter from this church. R. Pierce Beaver, in his article, The Genevan Mission to Brazil, in the book The Heritage of John Calvin, provides some really helpful understanding for interpreting this brief record. He writes, when Pope Alexander VI divided the world in 1493, he gave Spain certain lands and Portugal other lands. The dividing line was shifted in 1494 and reaffirmed in 1506 by Alexander's successor, Pope Julius II. To everyone's surprise, part of Brazil crossed the line. Neither the Protestants nor the French court accepted the Pope's divisions. Therefore, the stage was set for a French Protestant colony in a region bearing the name France Antarctique in Brazil. Now, the leader and really the villain of this expedition to Brazil was the governor Valegnan. Born Nicholas Duran, this man was a fellow student with Calvin in Paris. After serving as a knight, he pursued a naval career. And in 1555, Valegnan traveled to Brazil and established Fort Coligny. Due to a mutiny, the governor needed reinforcement, so he turned to the Huguenots and to Calvin. And Beaver, in his book or in his chapter, writes, the letter asked that the church in Geneva immediately send to Valegnan ministers of the Word of God, and with them numerous other persons well instructed in the Christian religion, in order better to reform him and his people, and to bring the savages to the knowledge of their salvation. And thus the question of missions was set squarely before the church in Geneva. Upon receiving these letters and hearing this news, the church at Geneva at once gave thanks to God for the extension of the reign of Jesus Christ in a country so distant and likewise so foreign, and among a nation entirely without the knowledge of the true God. The response was positive. Now, among the recruits to go to Brazil was a young shoemaker named Jean de Larrey, who is in Geneva as a student of theology. De Larrey was responsible for the detailed account of the mission, and he himself was an active missionary to the Indians during his stay in Brazil. Later on, de la Rey was ordained to the ministry and became a noted minister in the Reformed Church. Also among this company were a number of young boys who were to live among the Indians, learn the Indian language, and interpret for the French. This is very forward thinking. Here you've got some young men. It's going to take them time to learn the language, but if you don't learn the Indian language, you're not going to be able to have much interaction with these Indians. So they were planning to be there for a long time and to carry on a very deliberate ministry to the Indians. When the expedition arrived at Fort Coligny in March 7, 1557, the governor received them joyfully. Beaver notes that Corrigulaire Dupont and the pastors announced that they had come expressly, in accord with his letter to Geneva, to found in that country a Reformed church in conformity to the Word of God alone. So they're coming to establish a Reformed presence in Brazil. Now, their first impressions of the natives were not exactly complimentary. Pastor Richier's first report to John Calvin was much the same. He wrote that the savages were characterized by unimaginable barbarism. They were cannibals, crassly stupid, incapable of distinguishing good from evil. What other people hold to be vices, these consider virtues. They were scarcely to be distinguished from beasts. Above all, they had no idea of the existence of God. They did not obey his law, nor recognize his power and bounty. The result is, Richier wrote, we are frustrated in our hope of revealing Christ to them. But however discouraging the prospect, the Genevans were not prepared to abandon the mission. Richier told Calvin that they would try to advance that enterprise by stages and wait patiently for the boys who had been placed with the Indians to grow up among them and master the language in a natural manner. He terminates the passage by saying, since where the Most High has given us this task, we expect this Edom to become a future possession of Christ. And so there's a real expectation. God is going to work here. If we're patient, if we're diligent, God will bring about good things. Well, sadly, the effort turned out very badly. Among the French inhabitants of Fort Coligny was a man named Jean Contact. He lobbied the governor to restore Roman Catholic practices. The governor was won over and began persecuting the Huguenots. Some of them left and tried to found another settlement. Others escaped by a small ship only to return a few days later. And of the 5 who returned, 3 of them were martyred for their Calvinistic beliefs before being thrown into the ocean. Now, they were given a chance to write a confession of faith, which is available. It's the Confession of Guanabara, and it's a very beautiful, moving confession of faith that these men wrote knowing that they were about to die for what they were testifying. Well, in the register of the Company of Pastors in Geneva at the time of Calvin, Philip Hughes says that abortive though this excursion proved to be, it testifies strikingly to the far-reaching vision which Calvin and the church in Geneva had of their missionary task. They were not running away from world missions. Now, it's interesting, this work failed because of the barbarity of this trade coat governor. But the Dutch came in the 1620s. They established another reformed presence, and they had even greater success. And they influenced especially that far eastern part of Brazil. Well, basically, having failed in Brazil, the Huguenots, under the leadership of Admiral Coligny, attempted to establish a colony in North America. In 1562, they made the first of 3 voyages from France to the southern coast of America. They landed first near the modern-day city of Jacksonville, Florida. The captain, Jean Ribault, erected a stone pillar near the mouth of the St. Johns River to claim the area for France. And he had rather extensive interaction with the local Indians. Sailing up the coast, they came to what is today South Carolina, and they established an outpost called Charles Fort near modern-day Beaufort, South Carolina. 28 men were left to man the fort while Ribault returned to France for more men and supplies. They lasted about a year, but due to a fire in the supply area and a dwindling amount of food, Charles Fort was eventually abandoned as another failed attempt. Some of the men there built a ship and returned to Europe. In 1564, another expedition was sent under the leadership of Captain René Laudonnière. Before starting construction of Fort Carillon, the commander did the following. He writes, "The next day at reveille, I ordered that a trumpet be sounded so that we could assemble and give thanks to the Lord for our favorable and happy arrival. We sang praises to the Lord, beseeching him to continue to give his accustomed bounty to us, his poor servants, and furthermore to aid us in all of our enterprises, so that everything would turn out for his glory and for the advancement of our faith." Laudonnière observed the Timucuan Indians in this area, and he commented, "They have no knowledge of God, also no knowledge of any religion except what is apparent to them, such as the sun and the moon." He learned enough of the Indian language to be able to understand and to communicate with these Indians. Another member of the expedition was Jacques Lemoyne. Like de la Rey had done in Brazil, Lemoyne provided interesting anthropological observations about the native tribes. But unlike de la Rey, Lemoyne was an artist who came along on the expedition as the official cartographer for the expedition. And his later artwork provides a rather unique look at the 16th century American Indians. And we have some slides here. Here they are treating the sick, taking care of those who have been injured or who have fallen sick. This is interesting, hunting alligators. And that's the way you can kill an alligator. You turn it on its back, and it goes unconscious. And so they're sticking a pole down its throat, an oversized alligator, flipping it over and killing it, and then eating it. And then what do you do with the meat? You smoke it, because everyone loves smoked meat. Here they are fighting their enemies. Rather vicious, barbaric, very cruel to their enemies. Here is the chief, Utina, consulting a sorcerer before going into battle. That looks just demonic. And this was another disturbing one, the French witnessing child sacrifice by the Indians. If you look over on the right, there's a woman carrying a baby over to the place where the child will be sacrificed. So they're making observations about the Indians generally, but they're also observing their religious perspectives and habits. So I think those are interesting as far as understanding a bit more about what the French were encountering there. Well, in 1565, a third voyage was made to Fort Caroline under the direction of, again, Captain Jean Ribault. And among the Huguenots arriving on this third voyage, there were 2 Reformed pastors, just like in Brazil. Writing about a French return to Florida in 1569, the historian of the French Navy reports that when they landed, and this is 4 years later, the Indians greeted them thus: "You are welcome, provided you are true French," declared the chief Saturia. "We are," answered the young Trumpista, "and we have come to assist you." Saturia remained skeptical. "If you are true French, such as you declare, sing us the Psalms, as were doing Captain Laudonnière and Jean Ribault." When the bells of Carolina were ringing the hour of prayer, the savages were used to join our people on the public place, and they would, in their turn, raise their hands toward heaven with reverence. They recalled, among other, 3 psalms which they imposed as the criteria to the newcomers. The savages asked to sing the psalms, "Vindicate me, O God, and defend my cause. The mighty one, God the Lord, speaks." And then, "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High." And then sounded anew under the leafy Florida boughs the psalms of Moreau and the musical arrangements of Goudamel. The voices were silenced. The savages started a crazy dance. Their joy became a delirium. The test had been conclusive. Now they were certain they were dealing with true Frenchmen. Now it's interesting that they want to test these Frenchmen in 1569, and their test is sing the Psalms, because we heard our friends, Laudonnière and Ribault, singing the Psalms. And why don't you sing these 3 and prove that you're really French? That does suggest that the work among the Indians went further and deeper than you would imagine. Well, meanwhile, 1565, in nearby St. Augustine, there was a Spanish fort under the control of Pedro Menendez de Avilas. Being a Roman Catholic, they were determined to destroy the French at Fort Caroline. This is like an American version of the Wars of Religion. So in late September 1565, there was a brief battle between the French and the Spanish ships, and the French ships got the worst of it. Menendez then sent men overland to conduct a surprise attack on Fort Caroline. And most of the 250 inhabitants of Fort Caroline, Huguenots, were massacred by the Spanish troops. And so in this manner, the Huguenot presence in Florida was extinguished in similar ways to what happened in Brazil. So, was John Calvin really indifferent to the mission of the church? And was his theology incompatible with proclaiming Jesus Christ and Him crucified to every creature under heaven? Well, the evidence is strongly against all of the skeptics and the critics. Indeed, Calvin's practice, his writings, and even his history strongly suggest that those who know their God are best able to proclaim Him and His salvation to a lost world. So we as Reformed people living today do not need to hang our heads and be ashamed of our Calvinism. It is not a hindrance to missionary zeal. In fact, Calvinists have been in the past and should now be on the front lines of world evangelization. We should be as active as Calvin and the church in Geneva were at extending and spreading the gospel to every creature under heaven, that God might be pleased to bring his elect to himself, to build his church, and to glorify his name.